Senator Neil O'Donnell, please.
Alas Caherly agus ar dús bar bhilm fáilte a cur of an ira. Let's hear I want to begin by welcoming the Minister and indeed joining other colleagues in congratulating her on her own personal news of late. Minister, I'm sure you'll acknowledge and concede that it's very unusual for us to be debating an amendment, especially such a significant, substantial amendment at second stage of a piece of legislation like this. I don't, for 1 second, call into question your own personal bona fides on this issue as outlined by yourself, but like other colleagues, I do think it would have been a much more positive and indeed collaborative approach had you have engaged with the proposers of this bill and allowed this legislation to at least progress to the next stage. But in terms of my own remarks and my own view, and Sinn Féin will be supporting the bill as laid out by Senator Higgins and Ruan before us here today, I think it's fair to say that the people of Ireland, North and South, Minister, have a good idea of what it's like, what it feels like to live in a state of fear, and a fear for your life, and fear for the lives of your family and your friends. I think it's fair to say that we have all been living in very uncertain times, uncertain about one's health, uncertain about one's financial security, uncertain about the future. And all of this is as a result of the impact of COVID-19 on us personally, on our families and indeed on our communities. And the majority of the people who are in this uncertain state, by and large, come from a settled background and have an array of support mechanisms and resources, state, family and friends, which soften the sharp edge of the impact of the virus on us. And even with this welcome and necessary support, we are still on edge. Now, can you imagine having to deal with all of this pressure while you're a foreign national, maybe not able to speak English fluently, trying to adjust your day-to-day life to the streets of an Irish town, hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles away from your own home? Because that is the reality for many of the people who this bill is seeking to protect and help. And so when we're making our comments, one way or the other, on the bill, we have to remember that we're dealing with people's lives. We're dealing with people just like us here in this chamber, and I think that sentiment has indeed been reflected in the debate thus far. So it's important that in our overarching approach to this issue, Minister, that we remember the human stories. We get to know the human faces. Many of those who this legislation would seek to protect are undocumented. People who have come here and in many situations, as said by other colleagues, are working on our front line, assisting in the Irish effort to combat the pandemic. They assist people here. They are seeking to make Ireland home, to contribute, to add, to give. We very rightly want our own undocumented throughout the world to be protected and defended. We know, and quite correctly, laud the value that the undocumented Irish bring to their new home places. That is precisely why we, as elected politicians, argue, campaign and lobby so hard that they should be allowed to stay where they are. Minister, you said that your department and the Gardaí are taking a pragmatic approach to enforcement of deportation orders during the pandemic. And I'm glad that deportations have almost stopped during the pandemic, and I acknowledge the department for that, Minister. But as has been said by other colleagues, 4 people were deported to Brazil, an area with quite stark levels of COVID-19 infections. And almost 500 deportation orders have been issued during this pandemic. And those people with deportation orders hanging over them are in a very distressed state. Like us all, they are managing the threat that COVID-19 poses to them and their families, and we all know the mental pressure that that brings. And in addition to that, they're dealing with the pressure of facing deportation as well. I think the Minister should ensure that the Department adopt not only a pragmatic approach to this issue, but also a humane one. For the duration of the pandemic, the Justice Department should stop issuing deportation orders, and no one should face deportation. This emergency situation requires understanding, compassion, and it requires solidarity. And I must say, Minister, having reflected on some of the contributions thus far from across the chamber, there has been instances here where we have had no problem in pushing emergency legislation that may have repercussions down the line through this House at all stages, because we acknowledge this is an emergency situation. We acknowledge we are in exceptional times, and we have all taken decisions and voted for proposals and legislation that has come before us that in any other circumstances we would have, of course, preferred to have a much more nuanced and detailed and comprehensive approach to. So I think the proposal is outlined, given that it is a temporary moratorium by Senators Higgins and Ruan. should be adopted and should be adhered to by government. Not to dismiss anything that colleagues opposite have said in terms of the Minister's own discretion, but I'd finish just by saying, Minister, that these are very exceptional times. We all acknowledge that, and I think they require exceptional decisions. I think to implement this legislation would be a very clear and sure way for this government to show that understanding, compassion and solidarity that I referred to earlier. So let's go here. Takiam leis billa mar talogcha os ar gŵr ag Seanad Higgins agus Ruan. I support the bill. Thank you, Minister.
Yeah, míle buchas gur mai go Canada.